Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we follow a civilization that carved an entire city from rose-red cliffs and then, quietly, vanished from history without a clear goodbye. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of your body settle into whatever surface is holding you right now. Notice the warmth there. The quiet pressure of the blanket, or the mattress, or the pillow beneath your head. Breathe in slowly. And let it go. Tonight we are going somewhere very old. Somewhere the air is dry and faintly mineral, carrying the scent of dust and warm sandstone that has been baking in the sun for 1,000 years and more. The sky above is enormous. More stars than you have ever seen in a city. A silence so complete you can hear your own heartbeat. We are going to a place that was, for centuries, almost entirely forgotten by the outside world. A city carved from living rock, from the rose-red cliffs of a desert canyon in what is now southern Jordan. A city of temples and tombs and long colonnaded streets, of merchants and incense and spice caravans moving in slow procession through the narrow gorge that was its only entrance. A city that, at its height, held tens of thousands of souls. And then, quietly, gradually, mysteriously, it emptied. The people who built it, who shaped its stone facades and engineered its remarkable water systems, who traded silks and frankincense and cinnamon from Arabia to Rome, they faded from history. Their language stopped being spoken. Their writing stopped appearing on walls. Their name for their own city was forgotten. Tonight, we will follow them. Not in a hurry. Not rushing toward answers. Just slowly, gently, following the story of Petra and its Nabatean people through the long arc of their rise and their fading. Let your breathing slow. We begin at the beginning. Part 1, The Canyon at the Edge of the World. Imagine you are standing at the mouth of a narrow gorge in the desert of southern Arabia. The year is somewhere around the 4th century before the Common Era, roughly 2,300 years ago. The walls of the gorge rise on either side of you. They are sandstone, deep red and amber and cream, shot through with streaks of purple and iron orange, the layers of color running in long diagonal bands as though the rock itself is slowly unfolding. The walls are so close that if you stretch out both arms, you can almost touch them on either side. And they rise above you 30 meters, 50 meters, more, until the strip of sky above is just a pale ribbon of blue. This place is called the Sick. It is a natural crack in the sandstone plateau, formed over millions of years by tectonic forces and the slow work of water along a fault line. It runs for approximately 1.5 kilometers, winding and bending, narrowing and widening in long sinuous curves. The floor beneath your feet is smooth, worn flat by millennia of hooves and sandaled feet. And the walls, if you run your hand along them, are cool to the touch even in summer. There is a particular quality to the shade here. It is not just darkness. It is depth. It is the coolness of stone that holds the memory of ancient water. The Sick was not simply a road. It was, in every sense, a threshold. If you followed it, if you walked its full length, pressing through the deepening shadows with the echo of your own footsteps for company, you would emerge, quite suddenly, with almost theatrical abruptness, into a wide open space. And facing you, carved directly into the face of a sheer sandstone cliff, would be one of the most extraordinary things any human hand has ever made. A facade. 40 meters high. Columns and pediments and niches and sculptural detail, all cut from solid rock, all emerging from the warm rose-colored cliff face as though the stone had always contained it and someone had simply revealed what was already there. The top tier rising to a central rounded element, a tholos, flanked by broken pediments. And in the morning light, the entire surface glowing in shades of gold and amber, deepening to apricot, edged in shadow. This is the Khazna. In Arabic, the word means the treasury. It is the most famous monument in Petra, the image that appears in every photograph, the thing that stops travelers in their tracks. But the people who carved it did not call it the treasury. That name came later, from local Bedouin traditions that believed a pharaoh had hidden treasure inside the urn carved at its very top. The urn is pockmarked with bullet holes from generations of hopeful marksmen. The treasure, of course, was never there. What was there, what the Khazna actually is a tomb. Or, more precisely, a royal funerary monument. A place where someone of immense importance was honored after death. The precise identity of that person has never been definitively established. The building contains no inscription. Its interior is 3 plain rooms cut into the rock, containing no decoration, no sarcophagus, no grave goods. Whatever was placed inside it, whoever was meant to rest here, has left no trace that time has preserved. But the building itself remains. Perfectly, astonishingly present. In a landscape that has been carved and shaped and reshaped by 2,000 years of wind and earthquake and neglect, the Khazna stands as though it were carved only recently. The sandstone has the quality of preserving detail with remarkable fidelity. The columns are sharp at their capitals. The eagles above the broken pediments still spread their wings with authority. The urn at the summit still turns against the open sky. And behind the Khazna, if you continue through the opening of the canyon, you enter a wider valley, the main basin of the ancient city. And here, suddenly, there is space. Open sky. The red rock walls pulling back to form a broad, roughly oval enclosure bounded by cliffs on every side. And in this enclosed, protected, hidden place a city grew. Not a small city. Not a village or a trading post or a seasonal encampment. A city of temples and civic buildings and a colonnaded street and marketplaces and bathhouses and a theater cut from the hillside with seating for several thousand. A city that at its height was home to perhaps 20,000 permanent residents, with many thousands more passing through on the great caravan routes of the ancient world. The people who built it called themselves the Nabateans. And their story is one of the strangest and most quietly beautiful in all of ancient history. We know they arrived in this region sometime in the 4th or 5th century before the Common Era. Our earliest written references to them come from the early Hellenistic period, the turbulent decades following the death of Alexander the Great, when his generals were dividing up his vast empire and fighting for control of the ancient world. In those early accounts, the Nabateans appear as a mysterious desert people. Mobile. Difficult to catch. Experts in the landscape of the desert in a way that repeatedly frustrated the armies sent against them. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE but drawing on earlier sources, gives us one of the most vivid early descriptions of the Nabateans. He describes a military expedition sent by Antigonus, one of Alexander's generals, to subjugate and plunder this desert people who had accumulated significant wealth through trade. The first expedition arrived at the natural rock fortress, the place that would become Petra, and found it apparently empty. The people had retreated into the desert, leaving their belongings on what Diodorus calls a certain rock. The soldiers helped themselves to frankincense, myrrh, silver, and other valuables, and then departed. But the Nabateans returned. They surrounded the departing soldiers and killed most of them, sparing only a few to carry a message back, that the Nabateans did not forget. A second expedition was more elaborate. The Nabateans were surprised at night, many killed. But the survivors scattered into the desert and then sent back a letter, written in Aramaic, which Diodorus says so impressed Antigonus with its reasoning and its frankness that he decided to negotiate rather than continue the campaign. There is something remarkable in that image. An early Nabatean leader, in a moment of military vulnerability, writing a reasoned diplomatic letter in Aramaic, not Greek, and having it accepted as a worthy opening to negotiation by one of the most powerful generals of the age. It suggests, very early, the particular quality that would define the Nabatean achievement. They were not merely warriors or traders. They were thinkers, strategists, people who understood that words, and commerce, and the careful management of relationships, could accomplish what force alone could not. And there, in their hidden valley of red rock, they began to build something that the world would not fully understand until the modern era. Part 2: People of the Desert, Masters of Water. There is a paradox at the heart of Petra that rewards slow contemplation. The city was built in one of the driest places on Earth. The region receives fewer than 100 millimeters of rainfall per year, rainfall that arrives unpredictably, sometimes in violent flash floods that can fill a dry canyon with a wall of water within minutes, and sometimes not at all. The summer temperatures exceed 40 degrees Celsius. The rock and dust absorb heat and radiate it back in long shimmering waves. There are no rivers. There is no lake. There is no obvious, abundant source of fresh water anywhere near the site. And yet, at the height of Nabatean civilization, Petra was a city of perhaps 20,000 permanent residents with a water supply sophisticated enough to support fountains. Decorative fountains. Not survival taps. Fountains. This is what makes the Nabateans extraordinary. Their hydraulic engineering, their mastery of water in the desert, was, quite possibly, the single greatest technological achievement of their civilization. And it was an achievement that grew from deep knowledge. Not just engineering knowledge. Ecological knowledge. The kind of understanding that comes from living in a landscape for centuries, observing how water moves through it, where it collects, where it disappears, how to coax it and hold it and direct it. And inside the city, the water was distributed through ceramic pipes. Hundreds of fragments of these pipes have been recovered. They were terracotta-fired clay, and they were manufactured to fit together in a continuous run, sealed at the joints. A pressurized water system. In the desert. 2,000 years ago. Some scholars believe the Nabateans had, in effect, modern-style water mains running beneath the streets of Petra. Cold water delivered under pressure to the bathhouses, to the major temples, to the fountains in the colonnaded street. The wastewater was then carried away through a drainage system also carved into the bedrock beneath the city's streets. The people who designed this system were not working from textbooks. They were working from observation, from tradition, from generations of accumulated knowledge about how water behaves in this particular landscape. And that knowledge was, itself, a form of power. In a desert environment, control of water is control of life. The Nabateans understood this early and completely. But water was only one expression of a deeper pattern. The Nabateans were, above all else, people of extraordinary practical intelligence. They adapted. They observed. They were, in many ways, the most pragmatic civilization of the ancient world. Their early culture, before the building of Petra, was nomadic. They moved through the desert with their herds. They had no permanent buildings because permanent buildings could be found and seized. Diodorus tells us that they refused to drink wine because wine growing required permanent settlement. They carried water in skin bags. They traveled light. They survived in landscapes where no one else could. But they did trade. Even before Petra, the Nabateans were involved in the great commercial networks that connected the incense-producing regions of southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa to the Mediterranean world. Frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon and cassia. Spices from India arriving by ship at the ports of the Arabian Sea and then moving overland through the desert. Bitumen from the Dead Sea used in ancient Egypt for embalming that the Nabateans harvested from the lake's surface and sold to Egyptian traders. These trade routes were their lifeline. And they understood that the key to surviving as a trading people in a world of larger, more militarized states was to be indispensable. To be the ones who knew the desert. The ones who controlled the wells, the mountain passes, the knowledge of which route could be traveled in summer and which could not. The ones without whom the goods could not move. By the 3rd century BCE, the Nabateans had begun to settle. Petra, which they called, in their Aramaic dialect, Rakhmu, became their capital. Not in a sudden revolution, but gradually, as the advantages of a permanent, defensible base became clear. And with settlement came something else. Something unexpected. Art. The earliest Nabatean religious images are extraordinarily austere. They worshipped their principal deity, a god called Dushra, in the form of a plain rectangular block of stone. No face. No body. No figure. Just a smooth, upright stone. This aniconic form of worship without images, was unusual in the ancient world, which was generally saturated with divine imagery. It suggests a religious sensibility of striking restraint. But as the Nabateans settled and grew wealthy, as they encountered Greek artistic conventions through their trading contacts and as the Hellenistic world pressed in around them, something shifted in their visual culture. They began to carve faces. They incorporated Greek architectural orders, Doric and Corinthian columns, Hellenistic pediments, into their monumental facades. They developed a distinctive pottery tradition so refined and thin-walled that modern archaeologists call it eggshellware. They painted it with extraordinary delicacy, botanical designs, birds, scrolling tendrils, in reddish-brown paint on a cream background. This pottery is one of the most reliable diagnostic tools for identifying Nabatean presence at any ancient site. It is so thin, so carefully fired, so consistent in its decoration, that it stands as evidence of genuine artistic pride. Someone cared enormously about making these bowls and cups and plates beautiful, even in a context where their function was entirely practical. That combination, ruthless practical intelligence combined with genuine aesthetic ambition, is the particular signature of Nabatean civilization. And nowhere is it more fully expressed than in the city they carved from the living rock. Part 3: The Architecture of Eternity. There is a quality to rock-cut architecture that no built structure can fully replicate. When you construct a building from separate stones, or from bricks, or from timber, there is always the possibility of separation. The joints between elements are potential points of failure. Wind and earthquake in time can find those joints and work at them, pulling apart what hands assembled. But when you carve a building from a single mass of living rock, it is already one thing. It cannot be separated from itself. The columns and the walls and the ceiling are all the same material, all continuous, all held together not by mortar or architecture but by the simple fact of having never been anything other than a single body of stone. The Nabateans understood this. And they used it. The facades of Petra's great tombs, and there are hundreds of them, cut into the cliff faces on every side of the main basin, were not facades in the conventional sense. They were not the front faces of enclosed buildings. They were, in most cases, ornate entrances into relatively modest interiors. The exterior face of the rock received all the architectural elaboration, the columns, the cornices, the sculptural detail, the decorative moldings, while the interior rooms behind them were cut plainly and simply. This seems, at first, like an inversion of what we might expect. We tend to assume that the interior of a grand building is where the grandeur lives. But the Nabatean tombs were oriented outward, toward the city, toward the living. The dead were placed in the plain interior. The elaborate facade was for the benefit of those who walked past it, who looked up at it, who understood its architectural vocabulary. The facades speak a complex language. They draw from multiple traditions. The lower registers often use Greek Doric or Nabatean Corinthian capitals, Nabatean Corinthian being a distinctive local variation with simplified leaf forms and often diagonal rather than symmetrical placement. The upper portions of many facades use what archaeologists call a Nabatean crow-step parapet, a stepped battlement form derived from much older Near Eastern traditions. And somewhere in the combination of these elements, Greek rationalism and ancient Near Eastern symbolism, something distinctly Nabatean emerges. There is a tomb in Petra known as the Urn Tomb that illustrates this perfectly. It sits high on the eastern cliff face, above and to one side of the main city. To reach its entrance, you climb a long, broad staircase. The facade is restrained, not as ornate as the Kazna, but the setting is breathtaking. From the doorway of the Urn Tomb, you look out over the entire main valley of Petra. The colonnaded street below, the Khazar Alban temple at the western end, the mountains closing in on every side in their long gradations of rose and amber and bone white. The interior of the Urn Tomb is a large, barrel-vaulted chamber. Simple. But the chamber has, cut into the rear wall, 3 arched burial recesses, loculi. And on the back wall, above the central recess, faint traces of paint remain. Byzantine paint. Because at some point, probably in the 5th or 6th century CE, well after the Nabatean period had ended, someone converted this tomb into a church. A Christian church. Carved into the rock, high on the cliff. The inscription they left in Greek records the conversion. The long life of these rock-cut spaces, Nabatean tomb, Byzantine church, tourist destination, is itself a kind of history. The stone endures. The uses change. The people come and go. Beyond the Urn Tomb, the cliff face is studded with other facades. Some are grand, the Palace Tomb, the most elaborate of all, a facade that stretches across the full width of its cliff section and rises in multiple stories, incorporating freestanding upper elements that were actually built from separate courses of stone rather than carved from the natural rock face. This is unique in Petra. Most of the facades are purely carved. The palace tomb's upper story was constructed, suggesting that at some point, the practical demands of the design exceeded what the natural rock could provide. Then there is the silk tomb, whose name comes from the extraordinary play of color in the sandstone exposed by the carving. Swirling bands of red and white and gold and purple and blue-gray, moving in long curves across the surface like the folds of heavy fabric. The natural geology of the Nubian sandstone in this region produces these color patterns through the variable deposition of iron compounds at different periods in the rock's formation. The Nabatean craftsmen were not randomizing. They were reading the rock, choosing where to cut in order to reveal the most dramatic patterns. This is a different kind of artistry. Not the artistry of imposing a design on a passive material, but the artistry of listening to the material, of understanding what is already present within it and finding ways to bring it to light. There are hundreds of carved facades in Petra. Archaeologists have catalogued over 800 rock-cut structures, and survey work continues to reveal more. The majority are tombs. But the city also contained, and still contains, a great carved theater, probably dating to the 1st century CE and capable of seating 3,000 to 4,000 spectators. Cut from the hillside in the classical manner, with radiating wedge-shaped seating sections and a semicircular orchestra, it is a monument to the full integration of Nabatean culture into the broader Hellenistic world. Beside and behind the theater, you can see, cut into the cliffs, earlier tombs that the theater's construction simply sliced through. The builders of the theater did not reroute their design to avoid the existing tombs. They cut through them. This suggests either a reorganization of the sacred landscape of the city, or a pragmatic decision that the living city required these spaces more than the dead required their burial chambers. Either way, it is a fascinating collision of time periods, visible in the sandstone. The main street of Petra, the colonnaded street running roughly east to west through the center of the main basin, was lined with columns and with shops and with monuments. It was paved with stone flags. It had sidewalks. The columns that lined it, some of which have been re-erected in partial reconstruction, were Nabatean Corinthian in style. Between them, there would have been shade structures, awnings or light porticos, behind which the individual shops operated. Imagine walking that street at its height. The sounds of commerce, languages you might not recognize, since Petra was a meeting point for Nabatean, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Aramaic, and a dozen other tongues. The smell of incense, frankincense, is a resinous, slightly smoky scent, warm and slightly medicinal, very clean. The smell of spices. The smell of food being prepared, bread baking. The smell of animals, camels and donkeys standing at the edges of the thoroughfare, bales and boxes stacked around them. And above it all, on every side, the red cliff faces with their carved facades catching the light. The city was always in dialogue with its walls. Part 4: Gods, Kings, and the Nabatean Spirit. The Nabatean king sat at the junction of two worlds. On one side, the deep desert with its ancient gods and its older customs, the austere worship of Dushara, the supreme god of the Nabateans, and Al-Uzza, the great goddess, often associated with Aphrodite by the Greeks but older and fiercer in her Nabatean form. On the other side, the Mediterranean world of Alexander's successors, Hellenistic kings in Syria and Egypt who styled themselves as living gods, who demanded elaborate court ritual, who measured power in marble and gold. The Nabatean kings managed this double inheritance with remarkable sophistication. They maintained the traditional forms. The Nabatean king was never a god-king in the Egyptian tradition. He was a mortal ruler, deriving his authority from both divine favor and from the consent of his people. Nabatean royal inscriptions use the formula "King of the Nabateans who loves his people," an unusual formulation that emphasizes the reciprocal nature of the relationship between ruler and ruled. The king loves his people, not the other way around. And they adopted Greek language and Greek artistic conventions when it served the purposes of diplomacy and commerce. Nabatean coins were bilingual, the ruler's name in both Greek and the Nabatean script. Nabatean temples incorporated Greek architectural orders. When Nabatean merchants operated in the Mediterranean world, and they did, maintaining trading communities in Greek cities, in Delos, in Alexandria, in Rome itself, they operated comfortably within the cultural conventions of those environments. But at home, they remained distinctly themselves. The Nabatean script, a cursive form of Aramaic, was the language of daily life and of commerce and of religious dedication. Nabatean women held a social position unusual for the ancient Near East. They appear in inscriptions as dedicants in their own right, as property holders, as partners in trade. The Nabatean queen was not merely a ceremonial figure. She appeared on coins alongside the king, equal in face size on the obverse, a statement of symbolic parity that would have been remarkable in contemporary Rome or Persia. One of the most striking things about Nabatean religion is how it evolved. The early, aniconic worship of Dushra, represented only by a plain stone block, a beetle, gradually, over centuries, developed human attributes. Dushra began to be represented in human form on certain coins and dedications. But even in his most anthropomorphic representations, there is a restraint, a simplicity, that distinguishes Nabatean religious art from the elaborate divine imagery of Rome or Greece. Al-Azza, also called Alat in some texts, and associated by ancient writers with both Aphrodite and Athena, was worshipped at a great sanctuary just south of the main basin of Petra. Her temple, known today as the Khazar al-Bint, a name meaning roughly palace of the pharaoh's daughter, another later legend that attached itself to a much earlier structure, was the most important freestanding temple in the city. Unlike the rock-cut tombs and shrines that dominate the popular image of Petra, the Khazar al-Bint was built from cut stone blocks. It was, at its height, a magnificent construction, with its walls standing to their full original height and decorated with carved and painted plasterwork. Some fragments of this decoration survive. They show complex patterns, vine scrolls, rosettes, a vocabulary that blends Hellenistic and Near Eastern elements in the characteristic Nabatean synthesis. The Nabatean pantheon was wide and accommodating. They adopted gods from the cultures they traded with. Isis appears in Nabatean religious contexts, imported from Egypt. Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, found a place in Nabatean worship, perhaps because wine, despite the early prohibitions Diodorus describes, became important to Nabatean culture as their society urbanized and as they themselves became major wine producers in the Negev desert. Atargatis, the great Syrian goddess, appears in Nabatean cult. The religious world of Petra was syncretic not because the Nabateans were theologically confused, but because they were genuinely open to the divine in all its forms. There is a feature of the Petra landscape that speaks very directly to this religious openness. On the high places, the summits of the ridges and mountains that surround the main basin, the Nabateans carved outdoor sanctuaries. Standing on that high place at sunset, with the entire landscape of Petra spread below you in the last amber light, the ranges turning from gold to red to deep rose to violet, you understand something about why high places were sacred. It is not merely metaphor. There is something about altitude, about the opening of sky, about the compression of the world below into a single sweeping panorama, that produces a particular quality of awareness. The Nabateans felt this. They came up here to worship, to make offerings, to be in the presence of something larger than the city, larger than the canyon, larger than themselves. And they came down again, by a different path, the western descent, which passes the carved niches of the lion monument with its lion head waterspout, now dry, but once pouring a stream of fresh water onto the path as a ritual gift to descending worshippers, and the garden tomb, and a complex of small carved chambers. The entire experience of the high place was choreographed. Arrival, ascent, ritual, descent. A sacred journey through the vertical landscape of the city. This choreography, this careful attention to the sequence and pace of religious experience, suggests a sophistication of thought that we might not always associate with pre-Roman Arabian cultures. The Nabateans were not primitive. They were, in their own way, as philosophically refined as any civilization of their era. Part 5. The Incense Road and the Wealth of Nations. Somewhere in the ancient highlands of southern Arabia, in the region known today as Yemen and Oman, a tree grows. It is not a large tree. Its trunk is often gnarled and its branches sparse. Its bark is pale and papery, peeling in thin translucent sheets. But if you score that bark, if you make a small cut in its surface, it weeps. A milky, resinous sap seeps out and hardens in the dry air into small, irregular lumps. Yellow-white to pale amber. Slightly waxy to the touch. Burn it, and the room fills with a scent unlike anything else. Clean and resinous and slightly sweet, with a faint undertone of citrus. The smoke rises white and thin and fragrant. It is frankincense, the boswellia tree's gift to the ancient world. In antiquity, frankincense was not a luxury. It was, in a very real sense, the substance of religious life across the entire Near East and Mediterranean world. Egyptian temples burned it in enormous quantities. The Jerusalem temple burned it daily. The Ketoret, the sacred incense mixture prescribed in Exodus, had frankincense as its base note. Greek and Roman altars were wreathed in its smoke. Roman funeral pyres burned it in quantities calibrated to the social rank of the deceased. It was the medium through which the human and the divine communicated. And it grew only in one place. The southern Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa, essentially modern Yemen, Oman, Somalia, and Ethiopia. Nowhere else in the world will the boswellia trees grow in the quantities needed for large-scale commercial harvest. This geographical accident made those regions extraordinarily wealthy, and made the trade routes connecting them to the consuming world extraordinarily important. The land route ran north from the producing regions through the Arabian Peninsula. Through the Hejaz, the long strip of inhabited land along the western edge of the peninsula where seasonal rains allowed some agriculture and where oases provided water and rest. North through what is now Saudi Arabia. Through the Negev Desert. And into the settled world of the Levant, the region of modern Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, where it could be distributed westward to Egypt, northward to Mesopotamia, or carried by ship across the Mediterranean. Petra sat, with extraordinary geographical precision, at the point where this north-south land route from Arabia met the east-west routes connecting the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf and India. It was a node. A hub. The place where the routes converged. And the Nabateans controlled it. This control was not the control of military conquest, at least not primarily. It was the control of knowledge. The Nabateans knew the desert. They knew where the water was. They knew which passes were safe in which seasons. They knew which wells were reliable and which were prone to failure. They knew the language and the customs of the producers in the south and the consumers in the north. They were, in the most complete sense of the phrase, essential middlemen. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing around the time of Christ, gives us a remarkable picture of Petra at the height of its commercial power. He describes it as a city of considerable size and luxury. He describes the king eating at communal banquets with no more than 9 others, a traditional, intimate royal meal. He describes Nabatean women drinking wine along with the men, an egalitarian custom that surprised Mediterranean observers. He describes the Nabateans as people of unusual commercial shrewdness, who tracked every transaction carefully and imposed significant fines on anyone who was found to have made a bad deal. That last detail is fascinating. A culture that imposed fines for commercial carelessness. That viewed poor trading not as bad luck but as a kind of culpable negligence. This is the culture of people who understand, in their bones, that commerce is how they survive. Not agriculture. Not empire. Commerce. The goods that moved through Petra were extraordinary in their variety. Frankincense and myrrh from Arabia and the Horn of Africa. Cinnamon and cassia from Arabia, possibly some of it ultimately of Indian origin, moving through multiple intermediary hands before reaching the Nabatean network. Bitumen from the Dead Sea, used by embalmers and shipbuilders. Copper from the mines of Wadi Fainan, one of the great copper-producing regions of the ancient world, located not far from Petra. Gaza wine, moving in the opposite direction, south toward Arabia. Egyptian luxury goods, fine textiles, glass, papyrus. And from further east, through connections that are only partially understood, silk and pepper and other commodities that the Roman market craved. The scale of this commerce was immense. Rome's appetite for Eastern luxuries was bottomless. Roman moralists complained repeatedly about the vast quantities of gold and silver leaving the empire for the East in exchange for perfumes and spices and silks. Pliny the Elder, the Roman encyclopedist who died in the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, calculated that Rome spent 100 million sesterces per year on imports from Arabia, India, and China. He considered this a national scandal. But the spending continued. The Nabateans also extended their commercial network westward into the Negev Desert, a semi-arid region south of modern Israel. Here they established a series of cities: Oboda, Mamses, Haluza, Nesana, supported by an agricultural system of astonishing ingenuity. In a landscape receiving even less rainfall than Petra, the Nabateans used runoff agriculture, a technique of directing even the faintest rainfall over wide surface areas into concentrated agricultural terraces, to grow grain, grapes, and olives. The wines of the Negev, produced under Nabatean management, were in demand across the ancient Mediterranean. Archaeologists have found Nabatean wine jars in the Mediterranean world, in Egypt, in Rome itself. This multi-directional commercial intelligence, trading from the desert to the sea, from the south to the north, from the east to the west, producing goods in seemingly impossible environments, was what made the Nabatean kingdom genuinely powerful. Not armies. Markets. Part 6, Rome approaches. The world had been watching Petra for a long time before Rome decided to act. Rome's interest in the East was older than the empire itself. The senatorial republic had absorbed the Greek world, had fought and defeated Carthage, had extended its influence through Greece and Asia Minor and Syria. By the 1st century BCE, the Roman general Pompey had reorganized the entire Levant, marching through Syria, accepting the surrender of Jerusalem, incorporating what had been the Seleucid Empire into a new arrangement of Roman provinces and client kingdoms. The Nabatean kingdom was not absorbed in Pompey's reorganization. It remained nominally independent, a client kingdom, in the Roman terminology, meaning it was expected to be friendly to Rome, to supply troops when requested, to avoid threatening Roman interests, but otherwise to manage its own affairs. This arrangement was comfortable for both sides. Rome got a reliable buffer state on its eastern frontier, a kingdom that managed the desert and the trade routes and the always unpredictable relationships with the tribes further south. The Nabateans got Roman protection, access to Roman markets, and continued autonomy. But as the 1st century CE progressed, the situation slowly changed. The most significant development was not military but geographical. In the middle decades of the 1st century CE, navigators, probably Greek-speaking mariners operating out of Egyptian ports, worked out the pattern of the Indian Ocean monsoons. They discovered that these seasonal winds, which reverse direction twice yearly, could be used to drive ships directly from the Red Sea ports to India and back, completing the round trip in a single season. This was, in the fullest sense, a revolution. Before this discovery, the India trade moved overland or at best, in small ships hugging the coastline, making the journey in multiple stages over multiple seasons. After this discovery, large cargo ships could sail directly from Berenice or Meuse Hormuz on the Egyptian Red Sea coast to the ports of western India and return loaded with pepper, cotton, ivory, and gems. The effect on the overland routes was not immediate destruction, the land trade continued for centuries. But the balance of profitability shifted. Moving goods by ship was cheaper and faster and could handle larger quantities. The merchants who could access the Red Sea ports were at an advantage. And those ports were in Egypt, which was now a Roman province. The Nabatean kingdom found itself, gradually, on the wrong side of this geographical shift. Its wealth and power rested on controlling the land routes. As the sea routes grew in importance, the political and commercial case for tolerating a semi-independent Nabatean state grew weaker. The immediate political story of Rome's absorption of the Nabatean kingdom is, in some ways, anticlimactic. The last Nabatean king was a man named Rabel II. He ruled from around 71 CE to 106 CE, a reign of 35 years. He appears to have been a capable and energetic ruler, responsible for significant building activity in Petra and in the other Nabatean cities. During his reign, he seems to have moved part of the royal administration northward, to the city of Bostra in what is now southern Syria, perhaps anticipating the long-term pressures on Petra's commercial position, perhaps recognizing that the northern parts of the kingdom were more defensible and more connected to the Roman networks. When Rabel II died in 106 CE, without apparent successors prepared to resist, the Roman Emperor Trajan's governor of Syria, a man named Cornelius Palma, marched into the Nabatean kingdom and incorporated it into the Roman Empire as the new province of Arabia Patria, Arabia, with Petra as its implied center. There was no great battle. No siege of the rose-red city. No last stand in the sick. The province was organized quickly and apparently without significant military resistance. Roman coins were minted to celebrate the annexation. The title Arabia Capta, Arabia Captured, appears on these coins, along with a figure representing Arabia bending in submission. Standard Roman triumphal imagery. But what had actually changed? Petra remained a city. Its population remained. Trade continued to move through it. The temples continued to be served. The carved facades continued to look out over the valley. The water system continued to flow. What changed was the direction of investment and the language of power. Roman Petra was, by any material measure, a magnificent place. The 2nd century CE, the period following annexation, saw significant new construction. The colonnaded street was formalized in its current form. A monumental arch, the Temenos Gate, was erected at the entrance to the sacred precinct around the Kazar Albint. An amphitheum, a monumental fountain building, was constructed at the intersection of the main street with a transverse road. New bath complexes were built. The city was, in purely physical terms, more elaborately urban in the Roman period than it had been under the Nabatean kings. But the Nabatean language began to be displaced. Greek, the administrative language of the Eastern Roman Empire, became the language of official communication. Latin appeared in military contexts. The Nabatean script, while never formally suppressed, began to fall out of use in official settings. And the trade routes continued their slow shift southward, toward the Red Sea. Petra's geographical position, which had been its great advantage, was becoming less central. Something else was happening too. In the silence between the lines of the official record, a transformation was beginning that would not be complete for centuries, but was already underway. Part 7: The Long Fading. There are certain kinds of endings that do not feel like endings while they are happening. A city does not decide to die. People do not wake up one morning and agree to leave. The process is slower than that. It is a matter of a few families moving away because the market has been bad for several seasons. Of a merchant choosing to establish his warehouse in a different city, one that is more conveniently located for the routes he uses now. Of a craftsman's children choosing not to apprentice in his trade, because there is not enough work to sustain them. Of a public building that is damaged in an earthquake not being repaired, because the funds and the will are not there. These small, individual decisions accumulate. Each one is reasonable. Each one makes sense in its particular context. But together, over decades and centuries, they constitute the death of a city. Petra's fading was not caused by a single catastrophe, although catastrophe played a role. It was not caused by Roman conquest, although conquest played a role. It was not caused by a change in trade routes, although trade routes played a role. It was the product of multiple overlapping pressures, operating across more than 2 centuries, each one adding to the weight pressing down on a city that had, for so long, stood at the center of things. The first major blow was the earthquake of 363 CE. On May 19, 363 CE, a powerful earthquake struck the southern Levant. Modern seismological estimates place its magnitude at roughly 7.0 on the Richter scale, a substantial event. The earthquake was felt across a wide area. In Petra, its effects were severe. Archaeological excavations have revealed extensive destruction layers from this event. Buildings collapsed. The colonnaded street was disrupted. Many of the water distribution pipes were broken or displaced. The infrastructure that had made the city functional, the water system above all, was damaged in ways that would have required significant engineering effort and investment to repair. Some repairs were made. Archaeological evidence suggests continued occupation in Petra after 363. The city did not simply empty overnight. But the earthquake seems to have been the moment when the population began to decline significantly. The resources and the organizational capacity needed to rebuild a complex urban infrastructure on the scale Petra required were no longer easily available. The city that emerged from the rubble was smaller, simpler, less elaborately urban than what had gone before. In the 4th century, too, the broader political context of the Roman Empire was transforming in ways that affected trade. Christianity was becoming the state religion, and with it, the enormous consumption of frankincense that had underpinned so much of the ancient economy of Arabia began to contract. Christian worship, in its early forms, was deliberately distinct from pagan temple ritual. The burning of incense, so closely associated with sacrifice, with idol worship, with exactly the practices the early church was distancing itself from, was viewed with suspicion. This shift was not immediate or complete. Frankincense continued to be used in Christian liturgy, it has never entirely disappeared from it, and the Arabian trade continued. But the scale contracted. The volumes that had flowed through Petra in its great commercial centuries were no longer moving in the same quantities. The trade routes themselves continued their geographic shift. Palmyra, further north in the Syrian desert, had been a major competitor for the eastern trade even during Petra's heyday. After Petra's political incorporation into Rome, Palmyra had grown in importance as the primary node for the eastern caravan trade. Its own spectacular rise and fall, the brief empire of Queen Zenobia in the 270s CE, her defeat by Aurelian, the sack of Palmyra, was a separate story. But it illustrated the degree to which the commercial center of gravity of the Near East had shifted northward and eastward. By the 5th and 6th centuries CE, Petra was a provincial town. It had a bishop, Christian ecclesiastical organization had reached even here. It had the urn tomb converted to a church, as we noted, its new occupants painting the walls with the symbols of their faith. It had a small but continuous population. People still lived in the carved chambers, still drew water from the cisterns, still walked the paths between the carved facades. But it was a place living in the shadow of its own past. The great temples were either no longer active or had been converted to Christian use. The theater, if it still functioned, would have done so on a greatly reduced scale. The bath complexes were perhaps partially maintained. The colonnaded street, its paving broken and shifted by the earthquake and its repairs, was narrower and humbler than it had been. A second major earthquake struck in 749 CE. This one, again estimated at around magnitude 7, was even more destructive across the region. In Petra, it completed the work that the 363 earthquake had begun. The already reduced population suffered further losses. What buildings remained standing after 3.5 centuries of partial neglect were brought down. The water system, already failing, was now beyond repair without a massive communal effort that the small remaining population could not mount. After 749, the human presence in Petra contracted to a handful of families. The Bedouin peoples of the region, the Bdul, who still live in the Petra area today and whose ancestors were the last continuous occupants of the cave chambers and rock shelters, maintained their small community there. They knew the city as a place of shelter and of mystery. They did not know, in any systematic way, what it had been. The people who had built it, the language in which it had been described, the history of its kings and its commerce and its engineers, all of that had faded from living memory. The last Nabatean inscription known to us dates to around 356 CE. After that, silence. The language that had been spoken in the markets of Petra, that had been used in the counting houses of the caravan routes, that had been cut into the rock of dozens of dedicatory inscriptions in this city's temples simply stopped being recorded. It did not disappear in a day. Languages do not die that way. But over the 5th and 6th centuries, as the population dwindled and as the administrative and commercial functions that had sustained the written form of Nabatean evaporated, the language retreated into purely oral form and eventually, perhaps, even that was absorbed into the surrounding Arabic dialects. The Nabateans did not vanish. They became other people. Their descendants, in all likelihood, are among the populations of modern Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the broader Levant. But as a distinct cultural and political identity, as the people who had built and managed and inhabited Petra, they ceased to exist. Part 8. The Forgotten City. For roughly 1,000 years, the Western world did not know that Petra existed. This is a remarkable fact to sit with. One of the largest and most remarkable archaeological sites in the world, a city with hundreds of carved facades, with temples and theaters and colonnaded streets and an elaborate water system known only to the local Bedouin and to a handful of Arab travelers and writers who mentioned it in passing without attracting wider attention. The medieval Arab geographer Al-Idrisi, writing in the 12th century, mentions a place called Wadi Musa, the Valley of Moses, in the region we now call southern Jordan. There are references in early Islamic tradition to the area around Petra as a place associated with the prophet Moses and with the biblical narrative of the Israelites in the desert. The local population maintained these associations and called the landscape around them by names that referenced the biblical past. But the carved city itself, the Khazna and the royal tombs and the colonnaded street, went unrecorded by European travelers and scholars for the entire medieval period. The Crusaders built castles in the region. The Crusader castle of Wuira is visible from certain parts of the Petra landscape today, its stone towers standing on a ridge above the Wadi Musa. Crusader knights certainly knew of the valley. There is some possibility that they visited the site. But they left no detailed record of what they found there. The Ottoman Empire controlled the region from the 16th century. Ottoman administrative records mention the district. Pilgrims traveling between Egypt and the Hejaz, following the Hajj road to Mecca and Medina, passed through the region and were aware of ruins. But the ruins were not identified, not described in detail, not connected to their Nabatean past. The rediscovery, the moment when Petra re-entered the consciousness of the wider world, came in 1812. His name was Johann Ludwig Burckhardt. He was Swiss by birth, educated in Germany and England, and employed by the African Association, a British institution dedicated to geographical exploration, to explore the interior of Africa. He was preparing for this mission by traveling through the Middle East, improving his Arabic, deepening his understanding of Islamic culture, and exploring the geography of the region. He had heard rumors. In the literature of ancient travelers, Diodorus, Strabo, Pliny, there were references to a great Nabatean city in the rock. Arab informants mentioned ruins in the Wadi Musa, associated with the tomb of Aaron, the brother of Moses. Aaron was said, in Islamic tradition as well as in the Bible, to be buried on a mountain near this area. The mountain is still there, Jebel Harun, Mount Aaron, with a small mosque shrine at its summit, visible from the high places of Petra. Burckhardt was traveling in the guise of an Arab pilgrim, a necessary precaution for a European in a region where the local population was suspicious of outsiders, particularly outsiders who seemed to be surveying the landscape. He was calling himself Ibrahim ibn Abdullah. He decided to use the pretext of visiting the tomb of Aaron to explore the canyon. On August 22, 1812, Burckhardt entered the sick with a local guide who was increasingly suspicious of his motives. The guide demanded to know why this strange pilgrim wanted to visit Aaron's tomb. It was not a major pilgrimage site. Why was he looking so carefully at the walls? Why was he delaying? Burckhardt did not have long. He passed through the sick, emerged before the Kazna, had only a brief time to observe before his guide's suspicion grew too pronounced to ignore. He made his way to the shrine on the summit of Jebel Harun, offered his symbolic sacrifice, and departed. But he had seen it. In his journal, he wrote, "It appears very probable that the ruins in Wadi Musa are those of the ancient Petra." He was right. And when his journals were published posthumously, Burckhardt died of dysentery in Cairo in 1817, aged only 32. That quiet observation ignited a storm of scholarly and popular interest that has never fully subsided. By the 1820s, European travelers were beginning to make the dangerous journey to Petra. The region was not controlled by any central authority willing to guarantee traveler safety. The Bedouin tribes of the area were not universally welcoming. Early visitors arrived in disguise, or under military escort, or simply trusting to luck. Several were robbed. At least one was killed in the region in the early decades of exploration. But they came. Artists, scholars, adventurers, diplomats. The travelers of the 19th century were drawn to Petra with something close to compulsion, the sense that they were standing in a place the modern world had forgotten, touching stone that Roman merchants had touched, breathing air that had carried the smoke of Nabatean incense offerings. The British artist David Roberts visited in 1839 and produced a series of large, luminous lithographs of the site that were reproduced widely and distributed throughout the literate world. His images, romantic, dramatic, slightly exaggerated in their proportions but essentially accurate in their subjects, brought Petra into thousands of British and European drawing rooms. The Kazna, the theatre, the colonnaded street, the royal tombs, all rendered in Robert's characteristic warm golden light, often with small human figures for scale, dwarfed by the grandeur of the carved facades. These images created the visual template for Petra in the Western imagination. The rose-red city. The face of the Kazna emerging from the narrows of the sick. The scale, the grandeur, the silence. The poet John William Bergen, who had never visited Petra but who had seen Robert's images, wrote the poem that gave us the most famous phrase associated with the city. In 1845, he won the Newdigate Prize at Oxford with a poem about Petra, and it contained the line, "A rose-red city half as old as time." Half as old as time. The phrase is meaningless in any literal sense, but emotionally it is precise. It captures the quality that Petra projects, the feeling of deep antiquity, of endurance, of being a place that has existed since before history and will continue after it. Part 9: The Archaeology of Silence. What does a city leave behind when its people are gone? And in the 20th century, archaeology began the slow, careful work of reading those bones. Early archaeological work at Petra was limited by the political and logistical difficulties of the region. The first systematic surveys were conducted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by scholars like Alois Musil, who mapped the area in the 1890s, and by the early expeditions of the American schools of Oriental research. But sustained, methodical excavation did not begin in earnest until after Jordanian independence in 1946, and grew substantially from the 1970s onward. What the excavations have revealed is both confirming and surprising. They confirm the broad outlines of what the ancient literary sources describe: a wealthy, complex, urban civilization based on commerce. They have provided dates, pottery sequences, architectural phasing, and inscriptional evidence that fills in the chronological skeleton. But they have also produced surprises. One of the most significant surprises concerns the domestic quarters of the city. Petra is famous for its monuments, for the rock-cut facades, for the temples and the theater and the colonnaded street. But for much of the modern period, scholars assumed that the everyday population of the city lived in tents or in simple structures that had not survived. Excavations have shown this assumption to be wrong. The flat areas of the main basin and the lower slopes of the surrounding hills contain the remains of built structures, mud brick and stone buildings that formed the residential and commercial quarters of the city. These have survived less completely than the rock-cut monuments, for obvious reasons. But they are there, under the surface. And they are more substantial than anyone expected. The Brown University excavations in the area of the city center, which began in the 1990s, revealed a complex of civic and commercial buildings, including what appears to have been a marketplace, a tetrachionia, a four-column structure marking an intersection, and a large public building that may have served administrative functions. The architecture of these built structures was sophisticated, incorporating mosaic floors, painted plaster walls, and formal room arrangements suggesting considerable investment in comfort and aesthetics. The city center, in other words, was not just rock-cut monuments. It was a living urban fabric of built structures, streets, and open spaces, comparable in its organization, if not in its scale, to the great cities of the Roman world. A separate major discovery came in 1993, when archaeologists working near the Wadi Rum area, southeast of Petra, found a significant cache of Nabatean papyri, actual written documents on papyrus, a material that rarely survives in the archaeological record. These papyri date from the late Nabatean and early Roman period, from around 94 CE to around 131 CE, and they are entirely mundane in their content. Land registers, marriage contracts, sale agreements. But mundane, in this context, is the most extraordinary thing they could be. Because these documents give us something that monuments and facades cannot: direct access to the daily lives of ordinary Nabatean people. We learn names. We learn relationships. We learn the values of agricultural land and the terms of marriage contracts. We learn what people owned and how they transferred ownership. We learn that women held property in their own names and that the contracts documenting their transactions were legally binding and carefully worded. We also learn that the Nabatean legal system was sophisticated enough to produce documents of this complexity, standardized in form, precise in terminology, apparently the work of trained scribes using a conventional legal vocabulary. These are not the documents of a primitive people on the edge of civilization. These are the documents of a literate, legally sophisticated urban society operating within a complex commercial and property system. The site of Little Petra, a smaller rock-cut complex a few kilometers north of the main site, known in Arabic as Sik al-Barid, the Cold Canyon, has yielded some particularly intimate archaeological evidence. Inside one of the cave chambers here, now called the Painted House, there are frescoes, painted plaster ceiling and wall decorations in a Hellenistic style that would not look out of place in a wealthy house in Pompeii. Vine scrolls. Putty, the round-faced child figures that were a Hellenistic decorative convention. Landscapes with small figures. Birds perched in foliage. Someone commissioned these paintings in a dining room or entertaining space cut from the rock at the edge of a small but comfortable complex. Someone lay on a dining couch, looking up at painted vines and laughing children, eating food carried in from the serving areas of this little caravan traveler's rest house. Someone found pleasure in that painted ceiling. We do not know their name. We do not know exactly when they sat in that room, or what they talked about, or what they ate. But the painting is there, still, on the ceiling of the cold canyon, 2,000 years later. Still faintly colored. Still telling us, in the oldest and most direct way available to it, that someone was here. Part 10: The Language They Left Behind. There is one final mystery about the Nabateans that rewards slow thought, and it is perhaps the most unexpected of all. Their script, the Nabatean Aramaic writing system used in their inscriptions and documents, did not die with their culture. It transformed. Arabic, as it is written today, is one of the most widely used writing systems in the world. Hundreds of millions of people read and write it daily. The Quran, the sacred text of Islam, revealed in the 7th century CE, is written in it. The poetry of the Abbasid Golden Age, the mathematics and philosophy and astronomy of the Islamic Renaissance, the literature of a civilization that stretched from Spain to Indonesia, all recorded in Arabic script. And that script descended directly from the Nabatean script. This is not a small claim. It is not a matter of distant family resemblance or shared ancestry in some earlier common ancestor. The transition from Nabatean script to Arabic script is traceable in stages through surviving inscriptions spanning the 3rd to 5th century CE. The characteristic cursive quality of the Nabatean writing, the tendency for letters to join to adjacent letters, for the forms to become rounded and flowing rather than angular, continued to develop after the Nabatean political entities ceased to exist. And from that development came the script that became Arabic. So the Nabateans, those desert traders who vanished so completely from historical memory that the outside world forgot their city for 1,000 years, left, in a very real sense, the most widely read gift in human history. The writing system used by the world's billion and more Arabic speakers and readers, the script of one of the world's great literary and religious traditions, traces its lineage back to the people who carved the Khazna and managed the incense road. There is something deeply moving about this. A people whose name was forgotten, whose language stopped being spoken, whose city disappeared beneath 1,000 years of silence, and yet whose way of marking language on surfaces became the foundation for a tradition that continues to the present day. The connection between Nabatean and Arabic is not just scriptural. The Nabatean language itself was a dialect of Aramaic, the Semitic lingua franca of the ancient Near East, the language that Jesus is believed to have spoken, the language of commerce and diplomacy from Persia to Egypt for nearly 1,000 years. Aramaic and Arabic are sibling languages within the Semitic family, related, similar in their grammar and much of their vocabulary, but distinct. The everyday Arabic spoken by the people living around Petra in the centuries following the Nabatean period would have been recognizably related to the Nabatean tongue, and the transition from one to the other would have been gradual, dialectal, unannounced. The Nabatean script, borrowed and adapted for Arabic, is the most lasting evidence of this linguistic continuity. It is as though the writing outlived the language it was invented to serve, and found new work to do. There are other inheritances, less visible but no less real. The agricultural systems the Nabateans developed in the Negev, the runoff farming, the terracing, the water harvesting, continued to be used by the populations of that region for centuries after the Nabatean political entity was gone. Some of those systems are still visible in the landscape. Some of the terraces cut by Nabatean farmers are still used. The knowledge was not lost. It passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, without necessarily being attributed to its originators. The trade networks, too, continued in modified forms. The routes the Nabateans had managed became, in the Islamic period, the Hajj roads, the great pilgrimage routes along which millions of Muslims moved each year toward Mecca. The infrastructure of wells and rest houses and administrative posts that the Nabateans had maintained along these routes was taken over, modified, and continued. The geography did not change. And geography, in the end, was always the primary driver. And then there is the question of the Nabatean identity itself, the question of where they went. Modern genetic and historical research suggests what reason would already imply: they did not go anywhere. The people who identified as Nabatean, who spoke the Nabatean dialect, who maintained Nabatean cultural and religious practices, were the ancestors of the people who subsequently lived in the same region. They became, over the centuries, the rural and semi-nomadic Arab populations of the Transjordan and northern Arabia. Their identity as Nabatean, as a specific political and cultural category, dissolved. But their genes, their practical knowledge, their oral traditions, their ways of managing animals and water and trade, all of this continued, carried in the bodies and memories of their descendants. The Bdul tribe, who were the permanent inhabitants of the Petra cave chambers until the Jordanian government resettled them in the nearby village of Seyhan in the 1980s, are believed by some to be among the most direct descendants of the Nabatean population. They had lived in the carved chambers for generations, using the ancient cisterns for water storage, following pastoral and small-scale agricultural routines that in some ways reflected the ancient patterns of life in this landscape. Their resettlement was undertaken for reasons of heritage preservation and for the welfare of the community. The cave chambers are not adapted for modern life. But there was a poignancy in it. The people who had maintained an unbroken human presence in Petra through all the centuries of its neglect, through earthquakes and empires and the slow drift of history, they were the last link to the continuity of life in the Rose-Red City. They are still there, nearby. Some of them work as guides and merchants at the site today, selling their handicrafts in the canyon, leading tourists through the sick on horseback, maintaining a connection, personal, practical, daily, with the landscape that their ancestors have inhabited for longer than recorded history can fully trace. Part 11, The City Rediscovered, the World Transformed. There is a particular kind of knowledge that comes only from standing inside a place. You can read every description ever written of the sick. You can study every photograph, every architectural drawing, every satellite image. You can know the exact dimensions of the canyon, the height of its walls, the precise orientation of its curve. And then you step into it, in the early morning, before the tourists arrive, before the heat builds, in that pale clean desert light of 7 o'clock, and all of your advanced knowledge simply stops being adequate. The scale is different in person. The silence is different. The smell of the stone warm and faintly mineral, with something faintly sweet underneath, like water remembered in rock that hasn't seen rain in months, that is not in any photograph. The way the walls close in above you, reducing the sky to a narrow ribbon of blue, and the way the light changes from section to section as the canyon bends, now in full shade, now in a shaft of direct sun, now in a diffused warmth that seems to come from the stone itself, none of that is fully communicable. The 19th century travelers felt this acutely. Their written accounts of first encountering the Khazna at the end of the Sikh have a quality of almost desperate trying, the sense of reaching for language adequate to an experience that exceeds language. Harriet Martineau, who visited in 1846, wrote that she felt as though she were dreaming. Edward Lear, the artist, who visited in 1858, reportedly burst into tears when the Cosna came into view. The experience was not simply aesthetic. There was, in those 19th-century encounters, something more profound at work. These travelers were educated people, steeped in the classical tradition. They had read their Diodorus and their Strabo, their Pliny and their Josephus. They knew who the Nabateans had been, in outline. And standing before the Cosna, they were experiencing the meeting of that textual knowledge with a physical reality of overwhelming presence. This is what archaeological discovery does at its best. It closes a loop that has been open for centuries. It makes real what was only words. By the late 19th century, Petra had become one of the essential destinations of the educated traveler to the Middle East. It appeared in travel narratives, in poems, in novels. It entered the visual vocabulary of the era, its image reproduced in newspapers, in illustrated magazines, on the pages of geographic publications that were the popular science journals of their day. But the 20th century brought something different. It brought systematic scholarship. And with systematic scholarship came a revolution in our understanding of who the Nabateans actually were. The 20th century changed this. The Nabatean language was deciphered. It had never been entirely unknown, since the relationship between Nabatean Aramaic and other Semitic scripts had been understood in outline since the 19th century. But the systematic corpus of Nabatean inscriptions, built up through decades of epigraphic fieldwork across Jordan, the Negev, the Sinai, the Hejaz, and beyond, gave scholars a genuine internal view of the culture. The inscriptions are not, for the most part, literary texts. They are dedications, epitaphs, graffiti, property markers, milestones. The graffiti are particularly revealing. They are the casual marks left by travelers and pilgrims and merchants, often in remote locations along the desert routes, a simple record of presence. Such and such a person was here, and he remembered such and such. The human desire to leave a mark, to say I existed, here, in this place, it is exactly the same impulse that leaves smartphone photographs on social media today. Only 2,000 years older, and carved in stone. Among the most significant scholarly advances of the 20th century was the work of scholars like Nelson Glueck, whose surveys of the Negev in the 1930s and 1940s revealed the extraordinary extent of the Nabatean agricultural system there. Glueck's work, published in accessible form as well as in scholarly monographs, brought the practical intelligence of the Nabateans to a wide audience for the first time. The idea that a desert people had farmed the Negev, a landscape that seemed almost entirely inhospitable, using runoff agriculture systems of their own engineering, struck many readers as nearly incredible. And yet the evidence was unambiguous. From the 1960s onward, large-scale excavations at Petra itself began to systematically address the stratigraphy of the site. Jordanian archaeologists, followed by international teams from the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Switzerland, and elsewhere, began to work through the accumulated layers of occupation from the earliest Nabatean settlements through the Roman period, the Byzantine occupation, the Islamic period, building up a detailed chronological picture. The Brown University Project, the Petra Archaeological Project, the work of archaeologist Judith Mackenzie, whose meticulous analysis of the Petra facades established the architectural chronology of the rock-cut monuments, these and many other scholarly contributions built a picture of Petra that is enormously more detailed and nuanced than anything available to the travelers of the previous century. Mackenzie's work, in particular, transformed understanding of when and how the carved facades were made. By analyzing the architectural details, the evolution of capital forms, the development of the distinctive Nabatean crow-step motif, the changing proportions of the facade elements, she established a sequence of building phases stretching from the 1st century BCE through the 2nd century CE. The Kazna, she argued, was one of the earlier major monuments, probably dating to around 100 to 50 BCE. The great royal tombs, the urn, the silk, the Corinthian, the palace, were later, mostly from the 1st and early 2nd centuries CE. The development was continuous and internally consistent, the work not of isolated individual patrons but of a coherent architectural tradition evolving over time. This developmental picture matters because it changes how we understand the culture. The Nabateans were not copying other people's architectural traditions. They were developing their own, taking elements from the Hellenistic world, from the Egyptian tradition, from older Near Eastern precedents, and synthesizing them into something distinctly and recognizably Nabatean. The facades of Petra are not imitation. They are invention. And then, in 2016, satellite and drone imagery revealed something that changed the picture again. A team of archaeologists using satellite imagery analysis and drone survey identified, south of the city center of Petra, a previously unrecognized monumental structure. A large rectangular platform, approximately 56 meters by 49 meters, roughly the size of a large Olympic swimming pool, bordered by what appeared to be a colonnade. Not cut from rock. Built. A freestanding structure of considerable scale, in a part of the site that had not been systematically excavated. The discovery made international news. Not because it changed the fundamental understanding of Petra, it did not, but because it demonstrated, dramatically, that even in one of the most studied archaeological sites in the world, major structural features could remain unrecognized. The desert conceals. The scale of Petra is large enough, and the accumulated debris of centuries deep enough, that the surface of the site does not fully reveal what lies beneath it. How much more is there? Beneath the sand and the slumped stonework and the alluvial deposits laid down by 2,000 years of flash floods, what else waits? The honest answer of archaeology is that we do not know. Every excavation season at Petra produces new material. The pottery, the coins, the fragments of inscription, the building remains, the animal bones that tell us what people ate, the seeds preserved in destruction layers that tell us what plants grew in the gardens, the data accumulates. The picture grows slowly richer. But there are things that stone cannot tell us. The sound of the city. The feel of the markets. The names of the people who did not have their names carved in stone, the laborers who cut the tomb facades, the women who ground the grain, the children who played in the narrow streets. The ordinary life of Petra, its humor and its grief and its daily routines, is mostly lost. Mostly. But not entirely. In the papyri from the Petra hoard, a cache of carbonized papyri found in the Byzantine church at Petra in 1993, among the most significant recent documentary finds in the site's history, there are glimpses. 6 papyri, partially legible despite severe fire damage, from the Byzantine period. Late 5th to early 7th century CE. They record legal transactions involving agricultural land in the Petra region. They mention place names, personal names, mostly Greek and Arabic, reflecting the late antique cultural mix. They describe property, olive groves, vineyards, grain fields. Vineyards. In the Petra region. In the 5th and 6th centuries CE. Even in its diminished state, even after the great commercial period was long past, the Petra region was still being farmed. Wine was still being grown. People were still here, managing their land, writing their contracts, living their lives. The last people of Petra were not dramatic. They were not tragic heroes making a final stand. They were ordinary farmers and landholders and small traders, the last threads of a continuous human presence going back beyond memory. And they too, eventually, were gone from the carved chambers and the carved streets, gone not through catastrophe but through the slow attrition of possibility. Part 12. What Petra asks of us. There is a walk you can take in Petra that very few visitors make. Most people enter through the sick, walk to the Kazna, continue down the main valley to the colonnaded street, perhaps visit the Kazar Albint, perhaps climb to the high place of sacrifice. This is the essential circuit of the site. It is magnificent. But it is, in a sense, the performed version of Petra, the route organized around the most spectacular monuments, the path that delivers the greatest density of visual impact per kilometer walked. The other walk, the one that reveals something different, goes west from the main basin, up the long staircase carved into the face of the mountain behind the Kazar Albint, through a long intermediate landscape of smaller cut facades and carved niches and simple water cisterns, to a place on the far western plateau called Aldair. The monastery. The climb takes perhaps 45 minutes. It ascends through 800 hand-cut steps, winding up through the rockscape in a series of switchbacks and staircase sections, passing through a landscape that is quieter than the main valley. Fewer tourists make the effort and more intimate. The vegetation is different up here. Small desert plants in the cracks. Occasional trees. The smell of thyme. And at the top, you step through a final rocky defile and the monastery is before you. It is enormous. Larger, in its raw dimensions, than the Kazna. The facade rises approximately 47 meters high and roughly 50 meters wide. A single story of massive architectural elaboration, giant pilasters, a central doorway of imposing proportions, a great urn at the summit, flanked by eagles. The scale is almost physically oppressive at close range. You have to step back, and back again, to take it in. But the monastery's effect is different from the Kazna's. Where the Kazna is delicate, ornate in its upper story, refined in its proportions, the monastery is blunt and powerful. Its forms are large and simple, carved with a boldness that suggests confidence rather than refinement. It was probably a tomb, like the Kazna. It received its current name from the small crosses carved in its interior walls, evidence, like the urn tomb, of later Christian use. Behind the monastery, the plateau opens up. And from the edge of the plateau, looking westward, you can see the Wadi Araba below, the great rift valley that separates Jordan from the Sinai, and beyond it, on clear days, the mountains of the Negev, blue and distant in the afternoon light. To the south, the mountains extend in long ridges of red and brown and buff, without buildings, without roads, without any mark of the modern world. Just the landscape, exactly as the Nabateans saw it. Standing there, at the edge of the western plateau, with the monastery behind you and the desert ahead, something shifts in the quality of understanding available to you. You are not looking at a ruin. You are standing in a living landscape, still inhabited, still used, still breathing, that also contains the most extraordinary evidence of a vanished civilization that the ancient world has left us. The Nabateans built here because this place was defensible, because it had water, because it was located at the junction of the most important trade routes of the ancient world. They built with the materials the landscape provided, the stone beneath their feet, the pigments and the rock. They built in dialogue with the specific qualities of this specific place. They read the canyon and they answered it. And what they built has outlasted everything else about them. Their language is gone. Their political structures are gone. Their religious practices, the offerings at the high places, the Beatal stones of Dushara, the processional routes through the sacred landscape, these survive only as archaeological traces. The names of most of their kings are known to us only through Greek and Latin sources that recorded them with varying degrees of accuracy. The names of their architects, their engineers, their water system designers, these are entirely unknown. But the stone remains. And the stone, in its endurance, asks a question. What do we leave behind? The Nabateans did not set out to leave a legacy. They were not thinking, as they carved the Kazna, about what it would look like 2,000 years later. They were solving the problems of their own time, honoring their dead, expressing their power, demonstrating their sophistication to the passing caravans and to the diplomats of the Mediterranean world. They were doing what people have always done, living, building, working, worshipping, eating, loving, arguing, dying. The legacy was incidental. Or perhaps more accurately, the legacy was the inevitable byproduct of the depth of their investment in quality, in beauty, in the particular and the specific rather than the generic and the temporary. And that, perhaps, is the deepest thing that Petra tells us. Not the political history of the Nabatean kingdom, though that is remarkable. Not the engineering achievement of the water system, though that is extraordinary. Not the aesthetic achievement of the rock-cut architecture, though that is without parallel. The deepest thing is this: care endures. The things that have survived, the things we can still see and touch and contemplate, are the things that were made with attention, with patience, with the willingness to do a thing as well as it could be done, in the specific materials of this specific place, for the specific purposes of this specific moment in time. The Nabateans were, by any measure, a successful civilization. They were wealthy, intellectually sophisticated, technologically innovative, artistically accomplished. They managed the complexity of living at the intersection of multiple great cultural traditions, desert and city, nomadic and settled, Arab and Greek, ancient Near Eastern and Roman, with unusual grace. But they were also vulnerable, as all civilizations are. The geographical advantage that created their wealth became a liability as the trade routes shifted. The political independence they maintained for so long was eventually absorbed by a power too large to resist. The earthquakes that shook their city were forces beyond any human response. The slow drift of history that dissolved their identity into the surrounding cultures was not a catastrophe but a process, quiet, inexorable, the kind of change that looks different from inside than from outside. Only from the long view, the view we are taking tonight, looking back across 2,000 years, is the arc of the whole story visible. The rise, the flourishing, the long slow fading. And then the silence. And then the rediscovery. And there is something in that arc that is not merely sad. Because the rediscovery is also part of the story. The fact that Burckhardt pushed his way through the suspicious guide's resistance and came out before the Kazna in the morning of August 22, 1812, that is part of the story. The fact that David Roberts sat in the canyon with his drawing equipment and tried to capture in charcoal and lithographic ink what the light did to the rose-red rock, that is part of the story. The fact that archaeologists from 20 countries have spent the last 100 years carefully lifting the dust and reading the pottery and deciphering the inscriptions, that is part of the story. The Nabateans did not know that their city would be lost. They did not know that it would be found again. But in building as they built, in carving as they carved, in making things of the quality and the permanence that they made, they left the conditions for rediscovery. They left enough. Enough for us to sit with them, across the distance of 2,000 years, in the warmth of the carved stone, in the long quiet of the desert night, and know that they were here. That they mattered. That they still do. And so we come, gently, to the end of Petra's story, or rather, to a resting place in it, because the story is not yet finished. Archaeologists are still digging. The satellite surveys are still revealing new structures. The Petra papyri are still being analyzed. Every year, the picture grows a little richer, a little more detailed, a little more fully human. And if you could stand, tonight, at the top of the sick, and walk its winding length in the dark, guided only by the faint phosphorescence of pale sandstone and starlight, you would come, at the end of that walk, to the Kazna. And it would be there. As it has always been. As it will, in all probability, still be when the language in which these words are spoken has itself become something that scholars decipher from old recordings, trying to understand what kind of people we were. Closing meditation. Let the canyon fade slowly from your mind. Let the rose-red walls recede. Let the sound of the desert wind, moving through the narrow defile of the sick, grow very faint. Let the carved faces of the ancient facades soften into something felt rather than seen, a warmth, a presence, a memory of stone that has held the sun's heat for 2,000 years. You are here. In this room. In this body. The weight of the mattress beneath you. The warmth of the blanket. The particular quality of the air in this place that is yours. Breathe in slowly. And release. The Nabateans knew how to wait. They knew the desert's patience, the patience of stone that forms over millions of years, the patience of water that finds its way through solid rock across geological time, the patience of a trade route that functions for centuries because the geography it follows is the geography of the earth itself. That patience is available to you tonight. Let it settle into your shoulders. Let it move down through your arms. Let it reach your hands, where they rest. The city is still there, in its canyon, under the stars of southern Jordan. The stars over Petra tonight are the same stars that burned above the Nabatean incense caravans on their long slow journey north through the desert. The rock is the same rock. The silence, that particular deep desert silence, broken only by the occasional shift of the cooling stone, the far call of a night bird, is the same silence. It has held everything. The rise and the fall and the long forgetting. The rediscovery and the scholarship and the millions of footsteps of modern visitors walking the path that ancient merchants walked. It holds all of it without judgment, without preference, in the deep impartial patience of stone. You can rest now. The rose-red city waits. And you can let go of waiting. Let the story carry you the rest of the way, into the slower country of sleep, where even the oldest things are new, where the walls of the canyon glow with the particular gold of a morning 2,000 years ago, where the smell of frankincense drifts from an open temple door and a city of 20,000 people fills the valley with the sound of ordinary life. Sleep well. Let the stone hold you. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.